The SOS is sent. The space station Orion 9 floated silently in the endless dark of the galaxy, far from any known civilization. It was a quiet outpost, with only a few people stationed there. The crew of Orion 9 had long ago grown used to the calm and isolation. It was a peaceful job, monitoring space traffic, maintaining communication systems, and making sure everything stayed running smoothly. Captain Renail sat in the command center, her eyes glued to the console in front of her. She was reviewing routine messages, making sure nothing out of the ordinary was happening. It was just another quiet evening. But then, something caught her attention. A strange signal appeared on the screen. At first, it looked like a glitch, a random burst of static. But then the shape of the signal became clearer. It wasn't just random noise. It was a message. The message had an unmistakable pattern, a repeating signal that sounded like an SOS. But that wasn't the oddest part. The signal was ancient, sent from a part of the galaxy that hadn't been explored in centuries. It was as if the message had been traveling through the vast emptiness of space for years, waiting to be found. Renail frowned as she examined the details. The signal was unmistakably human. She could tell from the structure of the message and the patterns used. But why was it coming from a forgotten planet, one that had been abandoned long ago? She quickly forwarded the message to the rest of the crew. They had to act fast. Something didn't feel right. "We've received a distress signal," she said, her voice steady but with a hint of concern. "It's from a lost colony, Fearless 3. There's no record of anyone living there for over a century. But the signal, it's human." Her first officer, Jax, stared at the screen. "But Captain, if this colony has been abandoned for that long, why is this signal just showing up now?" Renail had no answer for that, but she had a bad feeling in her gut. "Send a message back. See if we can get any more details." Jax worked quickly, typing commands into his console. He attempted to send a simple reply, just a question, asking for more information. But there was no response. Only the same repeating SOS signal, growing stronger by the second. It was like the sender was desperately trying to be heard. Something didn't add up. If this was an old distress signal, why hadn't it been received before now? And why was it coming from Fearless 3, a planet that the Federation had long since given up on? There was no reason for anyone to be out there. Yet the signal was clear. "Captain, this doesn't make sense," Jax said, his voice filled with doubt. "If it's a distress call, we should send help. But if it's been out there for so long, why didn't anyone else pick it up before us?" Renail leaned back in her chair, thinking. The possibilities raced through her mind. Could this be a trap? Could someone be trying to lure them into a dangerous situation? Or maybe it wasn't a trap at all. Maybe it was a call for help from someone who had been stranded, waiting to be rescued. "Send a fleet out to Fearless 3, Renail ordered. "We can't ignore this. Prepare for a mission." Jax hesitated for a moment, but then nodded. "Yes, Captain." As the crew scrambled to prepare the ship, Captain Renail remained at the command center, staring at the screen. The signal continued to pulse, growing stronger, more insistent. It felt like it was calling directly to her, urging her to make a decision. She knew she couldn't ignore it, but there was a nagging feeling deep in her chest. Something was wrong, and she couldn't shake the thought that responding to this SOS might set something into motion, something they weren't prepared for. Meanwhile, on the distant planet Fearless 3, something ancient and powerful stirred. The message had been sent, and soon someone would come to investigate. But what would they find? The planet had long since been abandoned, its cities now overgrown and forgotten. Yet there were still signs of life. Strange, hidden forces moving in the shadows, forces that had been waiting for centuries. The crew of Orion 9 had no idea what they were walking into. They thought they were responding to a simple distress call. But this was no ordinary SOS. It was a warning. And as they traveled toward the unknown, they would soon realize that the message wasn't just a cry for help, it was a summons. And who, or what, was waiting for them? As the crew readied themselves to leave Orion 9, Captain Renail's mind raced. She had no idea that answering this call for help would soon plunge them into a war against an enemy they didn't even know existed. The Deathworlders were coming. And they weren't just any enemy. They were the fiercest, most relentless force in the galaxy. And now, the crew of Orion 9 had unknowingly called them to war. The signal's origin. The crew of Orion 9 worked tirelessly to prepare for their journey to Fearless 3. As they gathered their supplies and made final preparations, Captain Renail couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking straight into something dangerous. The signal had only intensified, and now there was no turning back. Her duty was to investigate and respond to the SOS, but part of her questioned whether it was the right decision. As the ship's engines roared to life, they entered hyperspace, the stars stretching into streaks of light. The journey to Fearless 3 would take several days, but Raniel felt the weight of those days bearing down on her. She spent much of her time alone in her quarters, staring at the map of the galaxy. Fearless 3 was in a remote part of the galaxy, far from any major trade routes or settlements. It was like it had been forgotten. The old colony had been established centuries ago, but no one had heard of it since. The last official report stated that the colony had failed due to harsh conditions, and the planet had been marked as uninhabitable. That was the last anyone had known about Fearless 3. So why was there a human SOS coming from there now? Rainael sat back in her chair, scanning over the data again. The more she read, the more questions arose. The message wasn't just any distress call. It seemed to be a specific request. The SOS contained coordinates, exact locations within the planet's vast desert region, as if whoever had sent it had known exactly who would hear it and where to find them. "Captain, we've got a problem," Jax's voice echoed through the comm system, snapping Reniel from her thoughts. He sounded troubled. Reniel quickly opened the comm channel. "What is it, Jax?" "We've decoded some of the signal's hidden data," Jax began, his tone uneasy. "It's a message, encoded in an ancient language we can't fully translate. But there's one word that keeps coming up, repeating over and over." Rainel's heart skipped a beat. "What word?" Jax hesitated for a moment. "Deathworlders." The word hit Rainel like a hammer. Deathworlders, the terrifying species from a distant and hostile part of the galaxy. They were legendary for their ruthless survival skills and immense strength. No one knew exactly where they came from, but stories of their ferocity and merciless nature were whispered in every corner of the galaxy. They were the stuff of nightmares. "Are you sure?" Raniel asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Yes," Jax replied. "The message is clear, Captain. Whoever sent this SOS wasn't just calling for help. They were warning us. This isn't a simple distress signal. It's a summons." Renel's mind raced. Could it be true? Could the Deathworlders be involved? Fearless 3 was supposed to be an abandoned planet, but if the Deathworlders were involved, that would change everything. Why would they be coming to a forgotten colony? What did they want? "Keep analyzing the message," Rainel ordered. "We need to know more about what we're dealing with." As the crew continued their work, the hours stretched on. The ship sped through the blackness of space toward a planet that had been hidden for so long. Rainel had hoped the journey would give her time to process everything, but instead, the closer they got to Fearless 3, the more questions arose. What had happened to the original colonists on Fearless 3? And why had they been abandoned? Were the Deathworlders involved in the colony's downfall? Or was there something more at play here? A power even greater than the Deathworlders themselves? With every passing moment, the crew of Orion 9 grew more uncertain. They had entered uncharted territory, and the deeper they traveled, the more they realized they didn't fully understand what they were up against. The planet loomed large on the view screen now. Fearless 3 was a desolate world, with vast stretches of barren deserts, ancient ruins, and nothing more. No signs of life. No signs of anything out of the ordinary. but that was before the SOS had been discovered. Jax's voice came through again, his tone more urgent this time. "Captain, we've detected something. There's an enormous fleet approaching from the planet's atmosphere. They're not human." Raynell's heart sank. The Deathworlders. They were here. "What's their size?" she demanded. Jax checked the readings. "It's hard to say, Captain, but from what we can see, it's massive, and it's heading straight for us." The crew braced themselves. They hadn't even landed on the planet yet, and already they were facing an enemy unlike any they had ever encountered. But what were the Deathworlders doing here, and why were they coming after the crew of Orion 9? Raynell had no answers, but she knew one thing for sure. Whatever the planet Fearless 3 held, it was about to change everything. Deathworlder fleet approaches. The Orion 9 slowly approached Fearless 3, its engines humming quietly in the vast emptiness of space. The planet now filled the view screen, a dusty, barren world that looked as though it hadn't changed in centuries. Its pale surface was marked by scars of long-forgotten battles and the remains of ancient cities now lost to time. But the crew's attention was not on the planet's surface. Their eyes were fixed on the growing fleet appearing in the distance, like dark shadows creeping closer. It wasn't just one or two ships, it was an entire armada, a fleet of massive, heavily armed warships, unlike anything they had ever seen. The Orion 9 was a science station, not a warship. It was no match for the Deathworlder fleet. Captain Raynell stared at the screen, her pulse quickening. Her worst fears were coming true. The Deathworlders were here. Jax, her first officer, was silent for a long moment. The fleet's size was staggering. It seemed like an endless line of ships, all moving with a terrifying, purposeful grace. "Captain," Jax said, his voice low, This is beyond anything we've ever faced before. The Deathworlders aren't known for their mercy." Raynell nodded grimly. "I know. I've heard the stories. But why now? What could they possibly want with Fearless 3? The crew had been preparing for an encounter, but this was nothing like what they had imagined. It wasn't just a skirmish, it was an invasion. The Deathworlders had never been seen in this part of the galaxy before, and certainly never on a planet that was supposedly abandoned. "We need to find out what's on that planet," Raynell said, her voice cold with determination. "If this planet is important enough to bring the Deathworlders here, then we need to know why." As the Orion 9 neared Fearless 3, the fleet moved into a defensive formation, their ships positioned like a ring around the planet. It was a clear sign that they were preparing for something, waiting for something. Raynell turned to her crew. "Prepare the away team. We're going to the surface." The crew had no idea what they would find when they landed. All they knew was that the planet had been abandoned for a century, and the SOS signal had come from somewhere deep within the ruins, somewhere no one had dared to venture before. As they descended into the atmosphere, Raynell could feel the tension in the air. The entire crew was on edge, knowing that whatever awaited them below could change everything. The Deathworlders had arrived, and they weren't here to make friends. The descent was smooth, but the moment they broke through the clouds, the crew saw the ruins below. Massive structures that once looked like grand cities now lay in ruins, half buried by the sand. It was as if nature had reclaimed the land, erasing any trace of human civilization. But there were strange symbols scattered across the landscape, markings that seemed to belong to no known species. "Land near the ruins," Raynell ordered. "We need to get to the source of the signal." The ship touched down on the desolate planet, the dust swirling around them. The crew disembarked, their boots crunching against the dry, cracked ground. The air was thin and dry, and the distant sound of the Deathworlder fleet hanging in orbit over them was a constant reminder of the danger they were in. As they made their way toward the ruins, Raynell's thoughts raced. Why had this planet been abandoned? What had happened to the original colonists? And what exactly had they discovered here that could draw the Deathworlders to this forgotten world? The ruins were massive, far larger than anything the crew had seen before. They seemed to stretch on for miles, towering structures that had once been bustling cities now reduced to rubble. It felt like they were walking through a ghost town, empty, silent, and foreboding. They reached the heart of the ruins, where the signal had originated from. It led them to a massive underground facility, its entrance hidden beneath layers of sand and debris. The door was sealed shut, but the crew managed to pry it open with ease. Inside, the air was cool, a sharp contrast to the burning heat outside. The walls of the facility were covered in strange markings, symbols that didn't make sense. They seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, as if they were alive. Jack stepped forward, his voice a whisper. "Captain, this doesn't feel right." Raynale looked around. The facility was ancient, its technology far beyond anything the crew had encountered. But what caught her attention was the center of the room. In the middle, a large, glowing sphere sat on a pedestal, radiating a soft, pulsating light. It hummed quietly, almost like a heartbeat. The crew gathered around it, unsure of what they were looking at. It wasn't just technology. It felt like something more. Something alive. "This is it," Raynale whispered. "This is why the Deathworlders are here." But before they could investigate further, a loud noise echoed from behind them. The door to the facility slammed shut, trapping them inside. The sound of heavy footsteps approached, and Raynale knew instantly who it was. The Deathworlders had found them. They had only just begun to uncover the secrets of Fearless 3, and already they were out of time. The Deathworlders were closing in. The Deathworlders' arrival. The air in the underground facility was thick with tension as the crew of Orion 9 stood frozen. The door had slammed shut behind them, and the sound of heavy footsteps grew louder with each passing second. Raynale felt her heartbeat quicken. They had come here to investigate a signal, a simple SOS, but now they were trapped on a forgotten planet, surrounded by strange technology, and faced with the deadly arrival of the Deathworlders. "Captain, we need to get out of here," Jax whispered urgently, his eyes scanning the shadows. The footsteps were getting closer. Raynale glanced around quickly. The facility had once been a hub of activity, but now, with the walls crumbling and the strange glowing orb at the center, it felt like an ancient tomb. She could sense the presence of something far more dangerous than they had anticipated. "Stay calm," Raynale said in a low, controlled voice. "We need to find another exit. Don't engage unless we absolutely have to." But it was already too late. The Deathworlders had arrived, their presence undeniable. The facility's dim lighting flickered, casting eerie shadows across the walls. Outside, the sounds of their ship's landing reverberated through the ground, shaking the very foundation of the ancient structure. The ground trembled with the force of their arrival, and the crew knew there was no escape without confronting them. A voice, deep and guttural, echoed through the corridors, sending a chill down Raynale's spine. "We have come for what is ours." Raynale exchanged a look with her crew. The Deathworlders were not here to negotiate. They weren't interested in diplomacy. They had come for something specific, something that had brought them across the stars to this desolate planet. "I think it's safe to assume they want the orb," Jax muttered, his voice tense. "It must be what triggered the SOS." Raynale nodded. The orb, glowing with an otherworldly energy, was unlike anything they had ever seen. It pulsed as if alive, its light bathing the crew in an eerie glow. Whatever the Deathworlders were after, it was tied to this ancient relic, and it seemed to be a source of immense power. Before they could act, the heavy metal door at the far end of the room slammed open, revealing the towering forms of the Deathworlders. They moved like shadows, their massive figures barely fitting through the doorway. The Deathworlders were formidable, their presence overwhelming. They wore armor that seemed to absorb the light around them, and their eyes, red and glowing, pierced through the dimly lit room. The crew was no match for them. Raynale's heart raced. She had heard the rumors, the stories of these fearsome beings, but seeing them up close was a different experience entirely. The Deathworlders weren't just brutal warriors. They were like a force of nature, unstoppable and relentless. The leader of the Deathworlders stepped forward, his voice deep and terrifying. "Give us the relic," he growled, his eyes narrowing at the glowing orb. Now, Rainael didn't have to think twice. She knew they were outgunned, outmatched. But they couldn't just hand over the relic. They had no idea what it could do or why the Deathworlders were so desperate to claim it. It could change everything. And she wasn't about to let it fall into the hands of a species like the Deathworlders without understanding its true power. "We don't know what this is," Rainael said, her voice steady but firm. "But we're not giving it to you." The Deathworlder leader snarled. "You do not understand. We do not ask for permission. We take." With a swift motion, the leader raised a weapon, a massive energy-based rifle, and aimed it at Rainael. The crew instinctively took a step back, their hands hovering near their weapons. It was clear. The Deathworlders weren't here to negotiate. Rainael's mind raced. There was no time to waste. They couldn't win a fight against the Deathworlders. They had to think of something else, something that would buy them time or give them a chance to escape. Suddenly, she had an idea. "Wait," Rainael called, holding her hand up to stop the Deathworlders. "You said this relic is yours. What do you mean?" The Deathworlder leader's glowing eyes narrowed. "It is the key to our power. It belongs to our people. You have no idea what you're holding." Rainael glanced at the orb. It hummed softly, almost like it was responding to the leader's words. She had to buy more time. She needed answers. "You're right," she said carefully. "We don't know what this is, but if it's so important, why was it left here? Why was it hidden for so long?" The leader seemed to hesitate for a moment, as if considering her question. "The relic was hidden because it is dangerous. The galaxy cannot know its true power. We were forced to hide it to keep it safe from those who would use it to destroy us. Now it calls to us. You should not have come." Rainael's mind spun. If the Deathworlders were this desperate to reclaim the orb, it had to be something of unimaginable importance. But what if the true danger wasn't the orb itself? But what would happen if the Deathworlders used it? The leader's patience was running thin. "Enough talking. Give us the relic." Suddenly, the room was filled with the harsh hum of weapons being powered up. The crew was surrounded. There was no way out. Rainael's eyes locked onto the orb, and she realized that the key to their survival, and the fate of the galaxy, was in her hands. She had one choice: hand it over and surrender to the Deathworlders, or find a way to stop them from unleashing the power of the orb. The countdown had begun, unraveling the mystery. The tension in the room was unbearable. Rainael stood frozen, staring at the glowing orb that now seemed like the only thing standing between her crew and certain death. The Deathworlders had made their demands clear, their weapons raised, ready to strike. The crew of Orion 9 was trapped, cornered in a room with no easy escape. But Rainael wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. "Listen to me," Rainael said, her voice steady but filled with determination. "We don't understand what this is, but we are not your enemies. We're only trying to understand the truth. If you can tell us why this relic is so important to you, maybe we can find a way to help you." The Deathworlder leader's eyes narrowed, glowing with cold fury. "Help," he growled. "There is no helping you. You've made a grave mistake by keeping it from us." Rainael's mind raced. If she handed over the orb, they would have no way of stopping the Deathworlders from using it. But if they kept it, they risked provoking a war that could spread across the galaxy. She needed to buy more time. She needed to understand what the orb was, what it could do, and why it mattered so much to the Deathworlders. She glanced at the orb again, its faint glow pulsing rhythmically, as if it were alive. There had to be more to this relic than met the eye. And as she looked at it, something strange happened. The orb seemed to respond to her gaze. It flickered, its light shifting, almost as if it were reacting to her presence. Before she could think any further, Jack stepped forward, his voice urgent. "Captain, look at this." He had noticed something that Renel hadn't. On the pedestal beneath the orb were faint, almost imperceptible carvings. They appeared to be in an ancient script, one the crew hadn't seen before. It was clear that the orb wasn't just a powerful artifact. It was also a key to something much larger. Renel motioned for Jax to bring up a translation device, hoping that it could decipher the markings. As the device scanned the symbols, a faint holographic projection appeared above the pedestal. The projection showed images of an ancient civilization, one that had long since vanished. It was a race of beings that looked nothing like humans or Deathworlders, their bodies elegant and streamlined, almost ethereal. The projection flickered and zoomed in on an image of the orb itself. The symbols around it seemed to indicate that the orb was not just a relic of power. It was a weapon, one capable of controlling vast forces of nature, even space itself. This is beyond anything we've ever known," Jax said, his voice awed and frightened at the same time. "This relic isn't just a tool. It's a weapon of unimaginable power." It cooled. Suddenly, the Deathworlder leader roared, interrupting Jax. "Enough of your lies. Give it to us now." Renel held up a hand, signaling her crew to stand down. She could feel the room closing in around them. They were running out of time. But she needed to know more. "Wait," Renel shouted. "You don't understand. The orb isn't just yours to take. It was hidden away for a reason." The leader paused, his sharp gaze fixed on her. "Hidden away? You think you know better than we do." Renel stood her ground. "No, but what if I told you that the reason it was hidden is because it's not just a weapon? It's a prison for something even worse than you." The leader's expression faltered for a fraction of a second, just enough for Renel to notice. She pressed on. "You came here for this orb because you believe it's a weapon. But what if it's something much more dangerous than you realize? What if it's holding back something? Something that could destroy not just you, but everyone." The leader's posture shifted slightly, as though he was considering her words, but his voice was still laced with anger. "You dare to lecture us on what this is? You know nothing of the ancient civilizations that came before you. We have guarded this weapon for millennia. It was never meant to be hidden. It is our birthright. It was meant to destroy the enemies of our people." Renel's mind was racing. There was more to this than just a fight over an ancient relic. The Deathworlders had clearly been searching for this orb for centuries, but the way they spoke about it, it wasn't just an object of power. It was a key, and it held a secret they didn't understand. "What if it's holding back a greater threat?" Renel asked, her voice dropping to a whisper. "What if the relic is not just a weapon, but a seal holding something inside, a creature or a force so powerful that if you release it, it could destroy you?" The Deathworlder leader's eyes widened for the briefest moment before narrowing again. "You are trying to trick us," he spat. "I'm not," Renel said. "I'm telling you the truth. This relic wasn't created to give power. It was created to imprison something that's been locked away for so long that even you, with all your power, could never control it. We need to learn more about it before we do something irreversible." A moment of silence passed. Then the Deathworlder leader stepped closer, his face inches from Renel's. "If you are lying, you will die here, and I will make sure the galaxy knows your name. But if you speak the truth, we might have a much greater war to fight, a war against something far more dangerous than any enemy we faced." Renel swallowed hard. She had no more time. The stakes had just risen higher than she could have ever imagined. It wasn't just the Deathworlders they had to worry about. It was what the orb might unleash. And whatever it was about to break free. The final stand. The air in the underground facility grew thick with tension as Renel stood face to face with the leader of the Deathworlders. The crew of Orion 9 was surrounded, the pulsating glow of the orb casting eerie shadows on the walls. The leader's red eyes narrowed in suspicion, but Renel knew she had little time to convince him. The stakes were higher than ever, and the fate of the galaxy now hung in the balance. "Listen to me," Renail said, her voice firm. "You don't know what you're dealing with. The orb is not a weapon. It's a prison. It's holding something far more dangerous than you could ever imagine. If you open it, you'll unleash chaos on the galaxy." The Deathworlder leader's eyes flickered with doubt, but his hand still rested on his weapon. His patience was wearing thin. "Enough of your lies," he growled. "This relic belongs to us. If you do not hand it over now, we will take it by force, and the consequences for you will be dire." Renail knew they couldn't fight their way out of this. The Deathworlders were far stronger, and even if they managed to escape, the Deathworlders would never stop hunting them down. She had to find another way to stop them, to convince them to listen before it was too late. "You don't understand," Renail continued, her voice almost pleading now. "You've been guarding this relic for centuries, but it wasn't meant to be released. What if everything you know is wrong? What if opening it means the end of everything?" For a long moment, the Deathworlder leader said nothing. His expression was unreadable, but Renail could see the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. She pressed on. "Please," she said, lowering her tone. "We can work together. We can unlock the true secrets of this relic. But we need time. We need to understand it. Otherwise, we're all doomed." Jack stepped forward cautiously, his voice calm but insistent. "Captain's right. We don't want to fight you. We want to help. But we can't do that if you force our hand. We need to know what this relic really is and what it's capable of. Please, let us work together." The Deathworlder leader's gaze shifted between Renail and Jack's, weighing their words. He didn't lower his weapon, but the tension in the room was palpable. For a moment, it seemed as if the situation might de-escalate, but then a deep rumble shook the ground beneath them. The entire facility trembled, and Renail's heart skipped a beat. Something was happening. The orb had started to hum louder, its glow intensifying, pulsing in a rhythmic pattern that seemed to match the shaking of the ground. The leader of the Deathworlders turned sharply toward the orb. "What is happening?" he demanded, his voice suddenly filled with concern. Renail's stomach dropped. She had no idea, but she could feel the power of the relic growing stronger by the second. She stepped forward, trying to approach the orb carefully, when a deep voice, like a whisper from the depths of time, echoed through the room. "Release me, release me." The voice was low, ancient, and filled with malice. The Deathworlder leader's eyes widened in shock. He took a step back, his grip on his weapon tightening as the voice grew louder. "Do you hear that?" Jax whispered. It's speaking." Renail turned to the leader. This is what I was trying to warn you about. Whatever is inside that orb, it's waking up, and it's dangerous." The orb's glow grew blindingly bright, and suddenly, a violent surge of energy erupted from it. A shockwave rippled through the room, knocking everyone off their feet. The walls cracked, and the facility shook as if the very planet itself was protesting. A shadow, dark, swirling, and full of power, began to form in the center of the orb. It was like a living storm, its tendrils of energy stretching out in every direction, ripping through the air with an unnatural force. Renail's breath caught in her throat. This was it. The thing inside the orb was breaking free. And it wasn't just any being. It was something ancient, something far beyond the Deathworlders' understanding. "No," the leader of the Deathworlders shouted, his voice filled with panic. "It must not be released." But it was too late. The dark energy from the orb surged outward, enveloping the entire room. The very air crackled with power. Renail could feel the temperature rise as the dark force spread like wildfire. The Deathworlders had thought they were coming to claim a weapon, but they had unwittingly unleashed a far worse force. Renail's mind raced. There was no time to stop it now. The being that was emerging from the orb was a creature of pure energy, something that had been sealed away for millennia. Its power was unimaginable, and the Deathworlders' ancient warriors were no match for it. "We need to stop it," Raynale said, her voice barely audible over the chaos. "We need to get the relic back in the orb before it's too late." But as she spoke, the creature that had been trapped for so long finally revealed itself. It was not a being of flesh and bone, but something far more terrifying, a swirling mass of dark energy, constantly shifting, its form taking shape in a way that defied all logic. The Deathworlders leader stepped forward, his eyes locked on the creature. "This was never supposed to happen," he muttered, his voice filled with a mix of fear and awe. "We've made a grave mistake." Raynale's heart sank. The creature, whatever it was already too powerful. They couldn't fight it, and they certainly couldn't control it. The room erupted into chaos as the creature lashed out, its energy ripping through the facility. The Deathworlders, once so confident in their strength, were now helpless against the force they had awakened, and the crew of Orion 9 was caught in the middle of it. Raynale had only one choice: to face the creature head-on and try to contain it, or risk the destruction of everything they had ever known. The final stand had begun. But would anyone survive it? The battle for the future. The room was plunged into chaos. The creature, now fully formed, loomed before them, a mass of swirling darkness and crackling energy, its shape constantly shifting as if it couldn't decide what form to take. Its presence was overwhelming. The air was thick with an oppressive force, pushing against everyone in the room, making it harder to breathe. Every pulse of the creature's energy made the walls tremble, and the ground beneath them seemed to quake with every movement. Raynale's heart pounded in her chest. She had hoped to stop this, to reason with the Deathworlders, to find a way to prevent this disaster. But now there was no time for hesitation. The creature had been unleashed, and nothing could stop it unless they acted fast. "We need to stop it," Raynale shouted over the roar of the creature's energy, her voice barely carrying through the deafening noise. "We need to put the relic back in the orb, or we'll all be destroyed." Jax, his face pale with fear, nodded, his eyes wide with disbelief. "It's too powerful. We can't control it." The Deathworlder leader was now on his knees, his hands clenched in despair. "You don't understand," he muttered. "This was never meant to happen. It was never supposed to be unleashed." The crew had never seen the Deathworlders like this, broken, fearful, and vulnerable. The creature's power was beyond anything they had anticipated, beyond anything they could even comprehend. But even as they stood there in terror, they knew one thing. If they didn't do something, if they didn't try to regain control of the orb, the galaxy itself could be at risk. Raynale's mind raced. She had no answers, only the desperate hope that somehow they could undo the damage they had done by removing the orb from its resting place. She turned to the Deathworlder leader, whose eyes were now filled with dread.